Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live. I'm your host, Tony Duty, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at University of Delaware. We broadcast on the HigherEdLive network, and you can tune in to Student Affairs Live Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our guest, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsor that makes Student Affairs Live possible. HigherEdLive is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. And for those of you listening in from your office or home, I hope you'll join us on Twitter and tweet to us your best questions, and we'll try and incorporate them into today's conversation. And now I am excited to introduce you to our guests today, who happen to be the authors of this excellent book. That I hope, if you haven't gotten, that you will order your copy now. And I'd like you to each start off by describing your current role and why this, well, who you are first, your current role, and why this topic was of interest to you. Bridget, let's start off with you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tony. So I'm Bridget Turner Kelly. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland in the Student Affairs concentration, and I have been teaching and researching in visual methods for quite some time, and have been just lacking and looking for scholarship and looking for resources on it. And then recently, or before we did this project, people would come to me, doctoral students or master's students or colleagues, looking for something on visual methods, either in their teaching or research or practice. And so it was just fortuitous that I found Carrie and that we collaborated with the authors in this book.
Fantastic. All right, Carrie.
Well, welcome. My name is Carrie Cordegas. I'm an assistant professor at Northern Illinois University in our adult and higher education program. I came to the work during my doctoral program and became really interested in the use of visuals and visual methods in research and then in pedagogy, and the possibilities for use of creativity and other modalities when we think about understanding or gaining information about a particular topic. And that led to my dissertation, which was about short-term study abroad. And during my data collection, I allowed students to either participate in a photo voice style, a modified style interview where they shared photographs of their everyday experiences during their study abroad experience in Spain, in Valencia. And other students chose to do a more traditional type of interview, and the comparing them while they were on similar topics of everyday experiences, navigating being and living and studying in a new country. The interviews with the photos were so much more rich because they had specific experiences to draw upon, and they had thought about which photo to bring and why and how. And so that sort of led me into thinking about and expanding my interest around the use of visual methods in research, pedagogy, and practice. And then was able to connect in with Bridget and some other great colleagues around this topic.
Love it. So I want to help give everyone a kind of a foundation here and maybe start off with some definitions. So Bridget, can you briefly define concepts like briefly, right? Photo elicitation, photo voice, visual content analysis, art-based inquiry, digital storytelling. You choose which ones you want to share with us. But I want people to understand this is really a toolbox, an array of methods that we can use.
Yes, absolutely. And this is exactly what I think people were looking for, is they've heard these terms but didn't necessarily see them played out in the qualitative research books or other research books they had looked at. And I'll just pick up where Carrie left off on the photo elicitation to start, which is a qualitative research method that Carrie used, in which the interviewer uses photographs that the participants took themselves for specific research purposes, usually to evoke information, or as Carrie said, feelings or memories that explain something specific, which is very distinct, but often I think they get conflated with photo voice, which is a form of participatory action research. So researchers working with participants, and it has an emancipatory, liberatory stance, which I think is just wonderful, because we find so much when we look at qualitative research methods that many of them are steeped in white supremacy or hegemony or dominance, and that is really steeped in emancipatory action. And it's often community-based. It encourages folks to serve as experts, so people in the communities are experts about their own lived experience and really document. And then it has some action component. And so that, what are we going to do about what it is we're documenting? And for those of people who are steeped in the community to be able to have their own solutions to that. And then visual content analysis, which is something that I think hopefully gets more people to think about the book, because we do this all the time in terms of thinking about all the visuals that come into us through Instagram, through our Google Photos, through our feeds, through Facebook, and just regular TV and regular media advertising. But it's not often that we can focus on what the messages are saying, both text and images, and what they say about a particular topic. And so, for instance, institutions' kind of social media accounts or websites or college view books kind of all use visual imagery to convey something that the campus values. And so to get folks to figure out how do we unpack that and really determine what it is people are trying to communicate. And then art-based inquiry adapts the tenets of creative arts, so something we're all familiar with from going through kindergarten and first grade and thinking about arts, to now thinking about how art can also be liberatory and emancipatory, and think about addressing social research questions through art. And so kind of think about the discussions of poetry or performance or sculpting or painting and coloring or drawing, and having folks, I think there's been a resurgence on like adult coloring books recently, and having folks really think about how they can express something that is often marginalized or isolated through their art, and then how can they have a discussion that really unpacks what that is saying about the topic. And digital storytelling, Carrie probably has more experience in this, and please jump in, Carrie, is really tend to consist of digital technology that uses assortment of media. So when we think of things like video clips or soundtracks for music or computer generated graphics and narration to construct a narrative that really centers the person's voice. And so personal voice becomes the kind of central vehicle for which folks are given the opportunity to tell their own story through a digital means. And I think hopefully you'll see a through line, as my colleague Dr. John Dugan always says, what's the through line between all these visual methods? Hopefully emancipatory, liberatory, action, and kind of personal voice is what I think about.
Carrie, anything to add to that?
I think I also think about visual methods in a couple of big buckets. One is sort of participant-generated visual methods, and others are sort of more artifacts or found or visual content that is already out there that is either analyzed by the researcher, or sometimes you share a photograph with participants and ask them to respond to. And so I think about both the ways we engage in participant-generated visual methods, which I think is sort of where Bridget and my work sort of aligns with. And then there's other folks who are doing some of this content analysis or using visuals to prompt participants regarding responses.
So you talk about artifacts, and Bridget, you mentioned view books and social media. I wonder if you've come across any research that has seen a disconnect between what the campus is portraying and how students actually engage. You're both smart. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Katie Jockel's work, I think in the chapter in the book, really has students take an assignment where they go out and kind of take their cameras and take pictures and really connect to pieces of campus, and has them analyze kind of what places do you feel like a sense of belonging to, and what places do you feel like are off the beaten path that had to take you a while to track it and get there. And then what does that then convey, let's say, about a multicultural center on campus and where it's located, or a statue that we have at the University of Maryland of Frederick Douglass and how it is situated, and what is the campus trying to communicate with that. And I think oftentimes, the campus may think, oh, this is wonderful, we have a multicultural center, and then the message that sometimes gets out is, well, it's in the basement, around a corner, behind, another building. And so it's great that it's there, but it's not certainly central to what maybe the campus values.
Love it.
There's been a couple of people who've done visual content analysis on view books, and like Nana Osakofi, she's done some. There's been some work around sort of looking at how institutions portray race and ethnicity through view books, and the demographic of the institution versus the demographic that are being represented visually within these view books, and sort of trying to project particular images around belonging, engagement, and diversity.
Excellent. So Carrie, I'm gonna throw this one to you. As you look at the use of visual methods for research, for teaching, for practice, what are some of the challenges? I mean, I want to maybe start with some of the benefits and then move to what some of the challenges are that discovered along your research here.
Sure. I think that, we live in a visual world. We're surrounded by visuals. And so are there ways that we can engage in different modalities and sense making through the use of images? I mean, I think about, in the Midwest, it's been, we've been experiencing a lot of bad weather lately, to probably say lightly. And so I've been narrating my life around my experience with weather and the challenges through, some Instagram posts. And so there's potential ways that we can leverage and use these images through what we see students using in their everyday lives. I think that some of the other benefits is that there's different reflective components when you come into an interview, either when you had to make a decision around bringing a photograph, or in some of Bridget's work where she gives time for the participants to draw their experience, a challenge from this past year. They have to sit and think and reflect about what's happening in their lives differently than just immediate response to an open-ended question. I'm the interviewer, I ask you a question, and your job is to respond back. There's some power in it, there's some shifting of power when you ask folks to bring in artifacts, either photographs or journals or art pieces, or have them engage in drawing that allows for some different sense making or time to thinking about experience. I think some of the challenges, particularly, time, there's different expectations and obligations of participants when I ask you to bring to an interview photographs on a particular topic. I think that there's different pieces around what does it mean when around reciprocity, or whose ownership of the photograph. If the photograph was taken for a research purpose, I'm using it for my research, but do I own that photograph, right? So, or am I using it? So I think there's some pieces around some challenges, and also around reciprocity and ownership and permissions, and big issues around potential confidentiality. If a participant submits a picture of their face, I have some options. I could blur that out, but does that change the meaning of it? And so there's issues around confidentiality. I think there are workarounds, but I think that there's some real ethical issues that we have to contend with when we're looking at images and visuals, and also images that may not have people but have institutions. And so how much do we need to protect institutions? I think those are questions to be asked. And so I think that there's exciting benefits, but also some challenges that we have to think through. And then there's resistance. I have, my students who I've done digital storytelling with, they're socialized to participate in class in a particular way. Being a good student means particular things, and doing an assignment often is about writing. And so when I ask them to use technology and integrate visuals with content and music and sound and narration, and then closed captioning, because we want to talk about, you know, accessibility, that project becomes, I think that's, you know, I mean, the modality and the literacy around using multiple representation of knowledge is exciting, and there's resistance because it's different. Oh, that was a long answer.
That was a great answer. So this for either of you, is there science that supports visual learning? And I've done quite a few presentations on presentation design, like PowerPoint design. So I remember quoting Richard Meyer, I think he was from UC Santa Barbara, who did lots of psychological studies on multimedia presentation, and that if you want students to retain information, like add a strong supporting visual, and you know, the retention goes from 10% to 65%. I'm totally making up that stat, but is there science that supports this?
Well, you're pretty close, actually, when you made up the stat, because it is, I would just, to piggyback on what Carrie said, the benefits of visual is that it's good on its own, and then when combined with a traditional narrative or writing, it exponentially helps students retain, and which is, like, you know, what I think as faculty members, what we all want is not to just talk and have people read, but have people retain things. But it's really how people absorb, retain, and process new information. And the majority of people, based on a number of studies that we cite in the book, argue that 65% of the general population are visual learners. So when we think about the general population, we're reaching 65% who that's their common mode. Doesn't mean they don't learn through auditory or kinesthetic, but most folks learn through vision, and vision takes up about half of our brain's resources, which makes it the single most powerful sensory tool that we have for processing and retaining information. And we think about if you believe in evolution and think about our evolutionary history, our brain was just wired to look at drawings and look at pictures and make meaning of them. That was some of our first language. And so we are rewiring our brains, you know, as we come with new technology and type as opposed to write. But it's still, as I said, the best thing that really sticks to our neurons because of how our brain is wired.
Now, Bridget, you touched on this a little bit, but I'm hoping you can expound on how we can use images to explore concepts such as privilege, oppression, class, and gender.
Well, I wanted to just pick up on what I said at the beginning when I was defining these terms about emancipatory, liberatory, personal voice, because that is, I think, was most, I think, surprising to me, but also just wonderful that after we finished the book and Carrie and I got together to write the afterword, the last chapter in the book, we looked through everything, and every single person had, when they talked about whether they use visual methods in research, practice, or teaching, there was this through line of, and it helped me do research that was socially just, that was inclusive. It helped me really dig into people's marginalized identities. People were much more open and willing to share some of their vulnerabilities through that. And so that was something that was, like I said, we didn't ask anybody who wrote a chapter that this is a social justice book or it needs to be about privilege or marginalization or inclusion, but without fail, every single author, when they were, just because they were using visual methods, had that through line in them. And so for an example, like David Nugent's study of LGBTQ plus individuals used generated photos that the participants took themselves. They did campus map drawings, and they did other visual methods to understand college success. And so when you think about having students really take ownership about what it means for them to be successful, and it wasn't a bunch of pictures of GPA or pictures of an A on a test. Instead, it was you know, a relationship that they had connected with, or a friend that they had made, or an achievement that they had learned how to do something. And so that was, I think, really having people take agency is something that's really been transformative in terms of using visual methods.
I love that you brought up college success. We're doing some strategic planning here at UD, and the concept of student success came up. And the pushback was it's often viewed in terms of graduation or academic success, not in terms of how students see their own success. And I remember reading that story in the chapter. It's something I need to revisit and share with our team.
Yeah, I hope that we start to expand concept of success, because I think it'll really draw in more students successful in the ways that traditionally are marked, but have them kind of feel better about it, I think.
Yeah. So you brought up things like statues and signage, and I remember some very specific stories that you shared in the book. Can you give some specific examples of how signage, imagery, or layout can cultivate or diminish the sense of belonging?
I think that we use visuals all the time on our college campuses, and they often are under sort of explored, or that they're designed to be, communicators of culture, right? These images on campus are designed to communicate particular values for the institution. Yeah, I used to, in one of my courses, I would do a campus art audit, and at a previous institution, and one of the groups would go to Fisk University, which is an HBCU in Nashville, Tennessee, and the art on campus sent incredibly strong messages about the history of Fisk, but also the history of education and higher education for African Americans in the United States. And so the art was, was very specific. In the library, there were images of I think in the early 1900s of students sitting and reading in the, and so there were these images of what they should be doing in college, those getting communicated. I think about my own campus, where we have banners on multiple buildings that says student success starts here, with an image of students on it, and in different disciplines, and representing different majors, and these are trying to communicate what we're trying to expect at our institution. I think that there's also some, messaging, and graffiti is one of those, and how do we allow or don't allow graffiti on campus? I think we're seeing a lot of resurgence around neo-Nazism on campus, and a lot of that comes through imagery, and how we address it matters, and these images aren't neutral, that we are using them to communicate values and belonging. And so I think we need to do more to interrogate what are we sending on campus, and how does that communicate our values, and promote belonging and inclusion and diversity, and education. The graffiti is a fascinating topic. I remember having a conversation with director of multicultural affairs, and them saying they wish folks didn't rush to cover up the graffiti right away, so that it became a conversation and dialogue around it. Do you have any thoughts on that? You support that, or cover that?
We got an interesting chapter in the book around art and art as healing. Kind of going back and forth. There was I think a case study, true example of some college Republicans on campus and some maybe more liberal groups on campus going back and forth. And this is around the 2016 election. And thinking about, leaving it up for one, educational purpose, but then for two, the harm that it's doing when it's up. And so I kind of like, instead of maybe a rush to cover it up, a rush to have a dialogue about it, a rush to kind of bring people to look at it and talk about it, and how do we as a community want to respond to it, and is this a value of ours? So I agree that we shouldn't just, for better words, whitewash things and pretend that they're not there, and that everybody on the campus believes the same. But at the same time, I think it needs to be addressed in a way that invites people who are facing real harm, both physically and emotionally, from those images, to have a place of healing.
Nice. So, Carrie, you brought up some challenges, and I'm hoping you can share some other specific ethical and practical considerations when using digital tools for research? Like you brought up blurring, for instance. What are some other examples?
Sure. So blurring faces is one way that you can mask identities. I think, you know, one of the things that became really a challenge for us was the resolution of the image in for the book in order to be reprinted. And so that became these technical things around you know, just making sure your images are high enough resolution. And you need to start with that when you're in the data collection phase. It's harder to make a resolution better, you know, if you take things at lower. I think the confidentiality, some of it is working with, for research, working with IRB offices who may have less literacy around what are options around visual methods, and there's ways, and many of us, and we have some practical solutions in the or advice in the book. I think about permissions. One of the things that we sort of came across is that in Chris Linder's chapter, she talked about she did some analysis around sort of social media activism on sexual violence awareness. And one of the images we wanted to use was this image of the student from Columbia carrying the mattress, and that became really difficult to track down who owned it to get permission, particularly when people are taking photos or want things to go viral. Tracking back who owns it or who can give permission to reprint became really a challenge. And that's how we ended up using sort of several QR codes in the book, because it lived online, we could link people to it online and get it and have it still honor sort of where it was. I think that the other thing is helping people. So some students are drawn, or participants are drawn to using visual methods. I mean, we've had my own experience where students wanted to participate because they wanted to express things visually. We've heard that from other people, is the fact that they were excited about thinking about being creative. And then there's people who are like, I'm not an artist. And most of us, it's not about, I think that's the other big thing, is that this is about process. And I'll hear that in the class. I'm not an artist. It's not really about an outcome of a masterpiece. It is about the process in which people engage with the information. And so that sometimes takes some education and work with folks around thinking about, it's the process of developing something, not necessarily the quality at the end.
That's funny. When you were talking about drawing to describe your experience, I think I have fairly good Adobe Creative Suite skills, but I can't draw worth a lick. Like, you asked me to draw something, I'm going to do a stick figure, and I'm like, well, how effective would I be if I was asked to do that? So I could feel my own sense of trepidation, and my stress level go up as you might ask me to do something like that.
It's a definite vulnerability. So when I asked faculty to draw a professional highlight, a professional experience from there, and I left the room and I gave them markers and a nice resolution paper so that we could reproduce it, because that's also something to think about for drawing. Most people were immediately like, "Oh, I'm not an artist." And again, as Carrie said, it wasn't about that. But as soon as I left the room and gave them that time, the left brain kicks in, and I always got different things that we talked about in terms of the drawings. And again, whether it was stick figures, whether they actually just wrote words on the page, or some people actually were beautiful in terms of their drawing abilities. But it always gave me new information that I wasn't getting just from the face-to-face, in-depth individual interview. That really changed the direction of our interview.
And I love integrating the QR codes. I used to tell folks, no, students are not using QR codes. Like, I don't understand why they would do that. But for this book, I absolutely took advantage of the QR codes and loved that I could just watch the videos on, or whatever you were sending it to me, on my phone. It really made a richer learning experience for me to have the multimedia embedded within the book. So
oh, good.
Yeah. So I'd like you to each dig down and share perhaps your favorite practical example story of that when someone, maybe you or someone in the book or someone else, employed visual methods for research and teaching. Let's start with Carrie.
Oh, I was gonna pass it to Bridget. I think for me, one of the projects I did was I did a study about LGBT students regarding campus environment, how that mediated their experience. And I asked them to bring photographs that represented concepts of inclusion, exclusion, safety, unsafe, and support, lack of support, and then what it meant to be a student at that institution. And some of the photos were, I got a lot of photos of fraternity buildings, which weren't particularly exciting, visually, but it provided a context for them to talk about the ways in which Greek life and gendered expectations and potential concern around safety mediated how they went about the campus. And so it allowed for some different mapping of space on campus. And it also allowed them to think about these concepts in particular ways. And so I think that there's some ways we can think about environmental assessments or campus environments around thinking about space differently. There's an example from the Michigan State using heat mapping, that when they did their campus climate study, they included a map where allowed people to indicate sort of places they felt more included or safe, and places that were more they felt that either they weren't included or unsafe. And so it allowed, and then they could look at the space by different demographics. And so it provided some visuals of looking at the space on campus, I think in different ways than you can get just from asking about, just the climate surveys are important, and how it doesn't always tell us how students are moving about campus. How are they avoiding places? How are there particular places that are that they feel more included in? Not surprising, and with my students, or the students in the study I did, they talked about the role of the LGBT Center on campus and how that was a place of inclusion and support, and then how other spaces weren't as safe.
Great. Bridget, you have a story you can share?
Sure, yeah. I'll also think about a teaching story that I think I briefly talked about in chapter 5 in the book, in terms of a photo elicitation project that I've been doing for years with a diversity course. And so at the beginning of the year, the first week of school, asked students master students to go out and within their everyday experiences, so their commute to school or their commute to work, wherever they're working, or their homes, or back on campus, to take pictures of what they considered to be privilege, oppression, or social justice, and then to write a small paragraph about why. And usually, and then we come back to class. The important part about photo elicitation is then to elicit a dialogue and a discussion around it. And so we talk in small groups and large groups about what people took. And it's always usually a distance. And so people will talk about those people or this thing or that campus or this. And then once we unpack the concepts and do dialogue and reading all throughout the semester, then at the end of the class, I ask them to do it again. And they can either use the same photos that they used the first time, but then talk about them differently, or they can take all new photos or a combination of. And what I love and what I always hope for is that students will turn the camera on themselves and they'll say, I represent, oppression in the ways that I am able to get married, for instance, or I'm able to have pictures of my kids at work without people making assumptions about me and my partner, and or I represent privilege, and they'll take a picture of their passport and talk about being a U.S. citizen and what that means, particularly in today's times with immigration issues. Or they'll talk about social justice, and they'll talk about, an organization that they've become aware of. And usually I get to become aware of all of these places through their photos. And so that is something that, for those that Carrie said who are used to writing, and they're used to writing papers, and they've been, English is their native language, and they've used it, and they've known it from K through 12 through college, to get to graduate school and say, take some pictures and think about it. It gives people an opportunity to express their learning in a different way, and a more intimate, what Robert Nash would call kind of scholarly personal narrative way, is to take the I and make that a source of learning, as well as whatever you're reading about or whatever you're studying.
I'm definitely going to borrow that.
Great.
So I'm going to take a chance to see if this works. I don't know if you can see this.
Can you talk again? Because then it gets really big. Okay.
Sorry, that was too much.
Yeah, that's good.
So, inspired by your book, we were looking at potentially a new student union on campus. So we took students on a bus road tour, and we looked at 9 institutions, and we gave them cameras. So student leaders from different areas, and we gave them cameras. And they came back with like 2,000 photos. And it was fascinating to see what different student leaders from different areas chose to photograph over the course of those tours. So we got together and we chose 80 of those photos, and we put them in a big way in these kind of art museum displays on our main walls in our student centers. And students can get little 1/4-inch dots, and then they place them on the, it resonated with them. And it is giving us such great data about what students want and what they like. And more importantly, we have the students who went on the tours, and we have staff there to engage students in dialogue around it. So the visual has been such a powerful spark to create dialogue about what a student center could be, and how it could better serve the students on our campus. So thank you for you got us on that path using visuals for that. So
that's an amazing idea.
That's a great example.
Yeah. And staff, and it sounds like staff and students and hopefully faculty are all in dialogue, which often doesn't campus issues.
They are. And the comment was, why didn't someone do this before? And I think people are excited about students having a voice, right? The fact that we value their input and we want to hear from them. I think
in a very different way than just probably saying, we're going to have a meeting tonight, come and talk about the student center. It's like, oh, am I going to show up for that? But the visual like draw people in.
And it feels more interactive, right, than saying, okay, do you want a coffee shop in the new student union? Do you want like a list of things, where it's some of the untangible pieces that it's about, right? Belonging. I mean, you want people to feel included in the student center. So it's not just about the coffee shop. It's about what that may feel like, look like, be like to be in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the photo tells such a better story than the words in this instance. You're exactly right. So I want to take a moment and ask you to dream a little bit here. So how might each of you imagine future technology, perhaps technology that hasn't yet been invented or created, being used for visual learning and research?
So I'm gonna take a picture out of my parent book, and suppose, because it's a big learner for me. I learned so much being a parent. I have an 8-year-old and 11-year-old. So when I saw this question, I was thinking about the apps and the ways that my kids use technology. And so my dream would be that future technology would have a representation of how we all show up now, currently, in the 21st century. Because, for instance, my daughter found an app, that storyboard, that allows her to write her own story, and she gets to illustrate it with the pictures, but she has to choose the pictures that the app has. And so when I'm looking at the story, I'm like, so did the app, my daughter she looks like a mini version of me. So beautiful brown skin. And I'm like, so all these pictures, they have white kids in them. And she's like, well, those are options to choose from how to illustrate my story. And so in the future, I think I would love to be able for her to have a range of options, or for her to draw her own, for instance, or pull from, you know, appropriate places on the internet. I can understand why people don't just want kids going on the internet and pulling pictures down, but it just seems like, and then the same with my son, who, as we were talking about before, is a big gamer and is doing Fortnite and all these other games. And when I look at both the representation of women, when I look at the representation of how they're attired, how they're dressed, when I look at the lack of diversity and gender diversity and gender identity, it's just, it feels like we should be there, but I guess that's a dream for the future, because it doesn't look like technology is necessarily keeping up with who's using it.
That's a great point. Yeah, I've got twin 8-year-old boys and an 11-year-old boy, and they're in the same stage. And I've not used Fortnite a whole lot, but as you talk about it, you're exactly right. I think we need to do a better job. All right, Carrie, what's your big idea?
Oh, I struggle a little on this, because I don't think I got into this because of the technology piece. But I've also been really, becoming more interested in the ways in which we can share and narrate through images, and the ways we use sort of apps or social media to do such. I think I think that there's a piece around how do we engage in technology. I know that, I'm part of it. My department is counseling adult and higher ed, and so there was some talking about sort of these virtual realities where people could be avatars and have virtual counselors, and sort of the non-judgmental piece of counseling that can happen in these sort of virtual spaces through avatars. On one hand, I think provides new ways of thinking about people who may, and that may have applications for student affairs around student services and advising, particularly this piece that we're talking about, the non-judgmental part, right? The fear of that I don't know something, or I'm going to look stupid, or people aren't going to, judge me a particular way, I think could be really powerful. And at the same time, I find it really concerning. I think that there may be a piece around wanting people to still have, be able to interact with folks in the real world, but that doesn't mean that they can't. And so I struggle around it. Around what is the role on some of this technology. And for me, I also don't want people thinking that visual methods is all about fancy technology. I think some of the most meaningful ways we can have people think about their experiences can be incredibly low tech, with a piece of paper and crayons. And so I think there's cool things that we can do with technology, and sort of the availability of the camera phone. I mean, if we just think about the ways that we take photos with a camera phone is different than 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. So it's allowed for new possibilities. I also don't want that to overshadow that not everybody has access.
Yeah, when you started talking about virtual reality, I reminded me of Second Life. Do you remember Second Life?
Yes.
Wondered what happened to that platform.
It was one of those things I heard of people doing it. I'm not quite that into it, but yeah, it's been really sort of thinking about what does that mean, and what are ethical considerations when we think about sort of using avatars and virtual reality to provide counseling or services or student affairs and interact with people. Is there issues? And it's probably like everything, right? Like there's ethical ways to do it, and ways that can be beneficial, and ways that can be particularly problematic.
Yeah. So there was a chapter written by a friend of mine, Paul Eaton, in your book.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul is always pushing, in my view, pushing the edge in what he does in practice and teaching. And he outlines in his leadership in higher education, he's got an online course and uses a Rhizomatic, maybe I'm not pronouncing that right, approach.
Rhizomatic, yeah, I believe that's how it's pronounced.
So can you explain that concept and perhaps share some highlights, takeaways from that chapter?
Yes, so Paul in this chapter talks about taking a rhizomatic approach to an online education leadership course. And there's a great little 3-minute, if you just Google a 3-minute theory rhizomatic, and it's RHIZOMATIC. It gives a little explanation, but sort of simply, it is an approach to learning that doesn't take a beginning or an end. It has a non-linear. So learners can enter into the content in any way they want. And it's true, and it sort of fractures linear approaches to learning, and it really tries to highlight the interconnectedness and interdependence of ideas. And so particularly in a leadership course, I think some of the linear ways is, right, you start with sort of theories about leadership, what might be different approaches, and then skills, etc. There's a linear progression. And so he challenges that through a approach that allowed students that there was a content bank of topics and readings that students had that covered different topics around leadership. And then there was an assignment bank, and students had to engage in both helping create content for the course, and at the same time choose assignments to represent materials that they want that week. And there wasn't a starting point. So you didn't have to start with history of leadership. You could start with critical approaches to leadership. And so it challenges, and the idea is it allows folks to think about interconnectedness of information and materials, which in an online learning environment can be really exciting way to approach learning and education. And in a face-to-face course, that might be a little more challenging, right? As that you sort of, students need to know what the topic of the week is to show up to class to discuss. But in an online format, there might be ways that we can challenge linear approaches to content delivery and engagement. He also talks a lot about the use of how do we use visuals in generating content and engagement in the class in different ways online than you do in a face-to-face class, right? And I think that's the thing, is that there's opportunities that potentially are different in online classrooms, but then there's limitations, right? So how do we use the medium to be pushing thinking around content engagement? I will say I borrowed some of his ideas for an online class I'm teaching right now on a seminar in community colleges, and particularly the quotograph, where students had to choose a quote from their reading, pair it with an image, and then did a little description about why they chose the quote and why they chose the image, in a little like sort of reflection. And the students have posted about how much they've loved this assignment, how interesting it was. And most of them did it on a book on big data and data analytics. So not a book you would think is like, quotable, but they pulled out some really good quotes. Like one quote, and I might be getting it wrong, but it was something about, institutions are data rich, but insight poor. And so they had this quote with the image, and right? Isn't that like, that's provocative because it's true.
I think that could probably apply to some individuals I know as well.
Right.
Data rich, insight poor.
Right. I might be off on the quote, but it was something like that.
If not, you should trademark it. It's good.
Right.
Yeah. So Bridget, I read that sometimes faculty in your book see the use of visuals as somewhat cynically and as a ploy to add relevance or interest to a course. How would you respond to faculty who share that view?
I would be skeptical of it. I think I would try to, I'm a dialogue person, so I would try to drill down to what it is they really thought, because I think that it's almost like student affairs and academic affairs, or qualitative research and quantitative research, and the fact that there's an assumption sometimes that it lacks rigor, that it's not as intellectual, engaging, that if you can't, measure it with a big T, survey or some high level, statistical analysis, that it's not as important. And like I tell a story, Carrie's heard this story, where I'm doing another book on the drawings that the women faculty did. And I brought it to a publisher and explained about how these women faculty, did drawings about their highlights and challenges for each year. It was a longitudinal study. And this woman from the publishing company just looked at me and said, we don't do picture books. And the way she said it was as if I was telling, Dick and Jane, Dick and Jane go down the hill, and here's a picture of two kids kicking a ball, and that it had no rigor, that it had no intellectual. And so I think I will, take my balls and go somewhere else, go to another publisher who will look at that. But I just think that I would just drill down on that. And I attribute mostly to how we're socialized around valuing numbers, around how we're socialized, lesser still, to valuing words and people's voices. And then how are we socialized to visuals? It's something that we associate with maybe advertising, and something that is for profit, and something that is a flash in the pan, and it's almost manipulative, right? So when you think about people being cynical about it, I think that's where our socialization comes from, and that's where we need to break down some of those assumptions.
So we are nearing the end of our time here. I want to be respectful of your time. I'm hoping you can close by sharing some additional resources, maybe some websites, videos. Can't really show a QR code, but other tips that might help viewers continue to explore and learn about these issues.
Well, I would definitely plug Dr. Amanda Latz's book on photo voice that came out after ours, and she's in the book as a chapter author, but it's just another resource for people who want to go deeper into that particular visual method.
There's also going to be a photo voice workshop at Ball State. Dr. Latz is organizing it on June 22nd. We also have Bridget, myself, as well as Amanda Latz, Katie Branch, Kristen McCain, and Chris Linder have a chapter in the review of article in the review of Higher Ed about the case for participant-generated visual methods and how that can enhance knowing. There's a lot of really good online resources. If you Google 30 sites and apps for digital storytelling, it brings up a sort of a bank of resources. It would be remiss if I didn't sort of say something about our book as a resource for folks. And lastly, if you're interested in our doing visual methods or thinking about other arts-based research, this year for this upcoming ASH conference, there's a new session type that is performance, visual, and digital scholarship, and it's designed to be about representation of information and knowledge in different, using different approaches. So an exhibition or video or performance or visuals, you can sort of talk about how you want to represent the knowledge, and it's designed to not be, this session is for folks not to present a paper or a poster or a symposium, but to actually do the type of display or a performance on knowledge. So if you're doing this work, I really encourage you to think about submitting it and submitting a proposal to ASH this year for the performance, visual, and digital scholarship session.
I love it. I really love this. I love the book. I love the dialogue that we've had. I think we are just getting started down this path. Maybe you're already working on this. I would love to see this be like a pre-conference institute at one of the national associations next year. If you're not in the works to do it already, I think it would get a lot of interest from folks. Before I moved over to University of Delaware, our programming board at my previous institution did a photo voice project with students, and it was fantastic. Lots of great insights, lots of great engagement, and it was program board related, something you might not think about in terms of research. So, yeah, so please do something. I would spend a whole day. I look at the pre-conference institute offerings, and I'm like, oh, I wish there was something on this. It would be fantastic.
Oh, thank you for that.
So thank you for taking the time. I know you're both busy folks at the beginning of the semester at your respective schools. I look forward to seeing you perhaps at NASPA in LA in a few weeks. I will be back next month with an episode on the topic of the science of sleep and how it relates to our work with students, and also how it relates to our own personal well-being. And I'm guessing both of you can relate to that topic.
Yes,
a little.
So you can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to the HigherEdLive newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to our iTunes podcast. I'm Tony Duty. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you make it a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.